and welcome to Tea and Strumpets, a Regency Romance review. I'm Zoe.
And I'm Kelsey.
And welcome, as this is our first episode, we thought we'd start by talking about how we're going to do things here. Each episode, we're going to discuss a book in the historical romance genre, generally Regency period, and all of its merits or lack thereof. You can read along with us as we'll announce our next book on this episode, or you can use our review to decide if you want to pick up the book at all. The awesome thing about this genre, and well, there's lots of awesome things, but one of the awesome things about this genre is that there's always a happily ever after, so we aren't spoiling the ending. We couldn't possibly do an awesome book justice just by gushing about it. So I think this leads us perfectly into a question before we begin discussing the book we're reading today. Kelsey, how did you get into historical romance?
So my history with historical romance is my friend and I have always been bookworms. She would recommend books to me all through college and high school started it. And then in college, she suddenly would send me, I was out in New York for school, and she sent me a whole care package of books and included a romance novel in it. She told me, look, my mom reads them and she's always cracking up. So I've started reading a few. I really think you'll enjoy this. One thing led to another. And suddenly, all I was reading was romance novels. So, Zoe, now that I've given you my brief history with historical romance, what's yours?
I had this friend who I was living with and working with, and she might be someone you're familiar with because she was you. And
oh, yeah. She sounds pretty cool.
I guess you could say so. She has her moments. But yeah, no, you said, hey, there's this book. I think you'd really like it. And I can't remember. Do you remember, like, were you saying that it was romance or anything? I really can't remember the introduction to this book that you gave me. Do you remember?
I think what it was I had looked at all your books when I first moved in. I looked at your book collection and I said, we have a lot of the same books. And I think one day you just asked me if I had any good recommendations. And I said, I don't know if you're interested or not, but I read a lot of historical romance and I've got a few good ones. And you were like, I've tried them, not into it. And I said, whoa, you got to read the right books. And so I think this is how I introduced you to this book, was because I had already read the series and I knew it was really fun and had fun characters, and it wasn't just like I will say, like 70s romance, 80s romance, or even current contemporary romance is sometimes hard to get into. But I think we all like some nice pretty dresses and some awesome scenery and some heroic deeds. So
yeah. Heroic deeds for sure. You know what's funny is when you say that I said, I've tried that before and it hasn't been like, I haven't been that excited about it. That sounds so like me, but I'm going to tell you right now, I hadn't really tried it before. And I'm so glad that I came back around somehow and decided to read it, because similar to you, I used to be like a really avid fantasy reader, and I still read fantasy, don't get me wrong. I love good fantasy novels, but it's pretty much all romance now. Like I'll get into like why I love the genre probably here and there, but specifically, maybe next week or something. But that's pretty much all I read now too. And it was funny because I was going through the books on my Nook and that I had, and I was like trying to figure out which one was which. I was really trying to find a specific book. I don't remember what book it was. And at some point I decided to make a spreadsheet of all the books that I had, and I think I was at like 175 of them, and I wasn't even halfway through the alphabet. So I've definitely read many. So,
as I mentioned before, romance novels are book candy. I introduced them to you because you were like, how are you reading all these books? And I said, look, I read romance novels because they don't take a lot of time. I can enjoy it. I know I'm going to enjoy it. And I can move on in like a day.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that about the genre. As I'm staring at my bookcase right now, and I've got some of my favorite fantasy novels on There's one series with 12 books and another series with only 3 so far, but each of those are over 1,000 pages long. And I swear I took a day off at least for one of them because I'm the kind of person that I just have to read the whole book. Like
Oh, I know.
I want to know what's happening.
I can't even tell you how many late nights I've spent with a fantasy novel or even just a regular novel because I get so wrapped up in the story that I just need to know what happens. And then it's, then suddenly it's like 2 a.m. versus like with a romance novel, if I start it early enough in the day, I can still go to bed at a decent time.
Yep, that's true. Or like occasionally I'm like, okay, I can put this down. I know they're going to get together. And I'm relaxed enough at this point in the story that I can finish this tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Today we're talking about The Perils of Pleasure by Julianne Long. So I did a little bit of research on her, and it seems, and I'm going to talk very briefly about her because I think we're going to read all of the Pennyroyal Green books in some fashion, and we're going to maybe talk about that a little bit more at the end. So I'll talk a little bit about her each episode, but this was her 3rd book, which I thought was interesting, the one that we're reading today. Her first book was published in 2004, so that's already, many years ago, but it still feels like yesterday. And she kind of stumbled into the genre, which I remember reading an article, and I thought this was really interesting because it was like, it really felt like she stumbled into the genre the same way I stumbled into the genre. Like, you gave it to me, and then all of a sudden I was like, yes, this is everything I love. Like, happily ever after. There's tension, there's excitement, there's a little bit of like usually empowering, like feminism kind of moments. Like, I just, it was what I wanted. And apparently her first manuscript, she like wrote it and was like, I don't know what this is. And someone was like, this is historical romance. So I thought that was interesting because I was like, she as an author didn't know what this was, but wrote it. And I as a reader didn't know that this was something I could read. And so I really liked that. So there are, as I kind of mentioned, this is part of a series. This is the Pennyroyal Green Series, and there are 11 books in this series. So our original plan with this podcast was to read a series in its entirety because I think there's a lot to discuss kind of about where a book ranks within a series, how the hero and heroine rank in the series. I think that that's like fun, exciting stuff to discuss. But 11 books is a lot of books to talk about one author for one time. So we're going to figure out how we're going to break that up a little bit and introduce some other authors and some other series in between, and maybe have like an overarching Pennyroyal thing, I think is what you and I were last discussing.
Yes, because as you mentioned, 11 books. We remembered reading the books. We did not remember how many books were in the series when we decided to pick it.
So the reason that I really wanted to bring this book as our first book kind of falls into the next section of like, have we read this book or not? And the answer, obviously, we've kind of both said is yes, we've both read this book. And the reason that I wanted to bring this one is because I think that this is an excellent entry-level book into the genre. If you know that someone's going to like this genre, this is a perfect one. And I think I'll circle back around to that after we've kind of discussed a little bit more of the book as to like the points that I think make this so exciting to be in the genre. But yeah, so it's a good entry, but there's a lot of books in this series. So yes, we'll figure that out.
Which is great though.
Absolutely. And as we'll get to, I think you and I were both talking about, what is it, the 3rd book, or is it the 4th or 5th book, which is Violet's book? And
oh yeah. Our favorite.
Definitely. Yeah, that's definitely our favorite. And I look forward to getting to talking about that one. So I wanted to talk about the cover of the book because I really hardly ever look at covers. Do you ever look at the covers?
Only when I'm picking out the book. But once it goes onto my Kindle, it's like I look at the cover when I click the book open, and then that's about the only time I look at it. And it's in black and white, so everything kind of blurs together.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I have an ink e-reader because sustainably I would just not be able to have, 400 of these books on my bookcases because my bookcases are already full. And yes, I am a millennial. And yes, I have bookcases in my house. And yes, I will always have bookcases in my house. But I do appreciate being able to have some of my books on an e-reader.
That's okay, because I have had a lot of them on my e-reader, and I have not enough bookshelf space. So I have most of my books sitting in plastic tubs in the garage. And it's really nice that at least on my Kindle, I have like an extra 200 no one even knows about.
So true. Yeah, definitely important. But I'm a balanced kind of person. There's certain books I want to have in my hand, and then there's others that I love to have in my pocket to bring with me everywhere. So one question for you, just real quick before we get to the synopsis, is how long has it been since you reread this book before we reread it for this?
Oh, I hadn't picked it up probably since I think I bought it in 2012.
Wow.
So I haven't read it since then.
Yep. I think I have probably not read it since, I don't know, I mean, a few years. I think I may have read it twice. It's possible I only ever read it once before this. And what did you remember about this book? Like, what would be your takeaway from what you remembered before this reread?
So I remembered that Colin Eversey was in trouble. He was going to be hung, and that he got rescued. I remembered all of that. And I remembered the twist at the end of it.
Oh,
The,
I
but it's
apparently,
the
I apparently
parental
don't.
twist.
Oh, that, yes. I was like, I don't remember the twist at the end of it, and we just read it. Oh, but I know what you mean now. Yes, yeah. I would say I remembered, this book was very kind of, it made a big impression on me, right? Because it was the first one that I read.
Mhm.
And I'm gonna say I remembered it being better than it was this reread. So, but let's dive right into that synopsis because we've talked about bits and pieces, and I think it's time to pull that all together.
All right. So here we go. The Pennyroyal Green Series opens with this book, Perils of Pleasure. We are introduced to not just Colin Eversey, who is the youngest son of the Eversey family, and we also get introduced to pretty much all the characters we're going to know throughout the entire series. We're introduced to all the members of the Redmond family, which is like the Montagues to the Everseys Capulets.
So true.
But we're also introduced to the local pub. We're introduced to the local pub owner. We're introduced to the many characters that make up Pennyroyal Green. We set the scene here. Everyone's very upset because Colin Eversey has not managed to get out of his trouble this time. He is set to be hung for the deed of killing someone in a bar fight. And
that seems like it just seems a little weak to me. Like the whole he's being hung thing for this crime, I totally get it because there's beef between the families, right? But I'm also
yes.
like, it just seems a little weak.
Yeah, but also to the fact that so the whole premise of it is he has been set to be hung because he was in a bar fight. The person he ended up killing was a cousin to the Redmond family, which already tells you it's going to be a bigger deal. So like Colin was arrested, and the person who could testify to like confirm his story that it was self-defense and the guy fell on his own knife, he has disappeared. So everyone's all upset, and Colin's literally walking down towards the gallows, and just before he starts to walk down, he gets whispered, "Count to 5, then duck." And he's like, "What?" So he does it. He counts to 5 and ducks, and sure enough, on his way to the gallows, which everyone is there to see, suddenly all these explosions go off. Pow, 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 pow.
It's very action scene. Like
Yes,
very
and in the
action scene.
chaos, He doesn't know what's happening because there's a bag over his head, and he's pulled from this gallows, and he's whisked away. All right, in the chaos, then he is set to meet our heroine. She is the one who has orchestrated his rescue based on an unknown benefactor who has paid her to rescue him. That's all she knows. It's unknown. She's set to get money. He's being stored in a place. They're going to come get him. She's going to get the rest of her money. That's all she cares about. She's ready to get out of town. She's had a hard life, ready to go.
Yeah, Madeline. And we find out too that we get a little bit of character development kind of later, which helps kind of pad this up, that this is something she does. It's not that she organizes escapes. She just organizes difficult things because she's got a knack for that. And I was like, oh, yeah, she's a smart woman. Yeah, I get it.
Basically.
But I loved that. I was like, yeah, because we're good at that stuff. Like, and I feel like you and I both share that characteristic, right?
Yes.
Of just like something weird or something difficult and like problem solving for it. So I appreciated that little tidbit about Madeline.
So then when he's supposed to be picked up by this unknown benefactor, suddenly someone shoots at Madeline. And then all of a sudden they have to go on the run because they're shooting and she's trying to be killed and no one knows what's happening and she doesn't have her money.
It's very confusing. It's like there's like a bunch of details, I will say, and then it's like, action, do we trust each other? What's going on? Why not this and why not that? And I will say it wraps up. Like we get conclusion for sure of all of the things, but it is there's like so many different things going on that it is a little confusing. Do you agree with that, or do you?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of moving parts at the beginning, especially when they're jumping from place to place. But you do get closure and you do get like good facts, so it all ends up in a good place. But basically, the new adventure that they need to go on is now Madeline and Colin need to band together. Partly because, he needs, what's the word of it? When you're trying to prove your innocence, he needs to...
I was going to say prove his innocence.
Okay, well, he needs to prove his innocence, and before he can do that, he's on the run.
Exonerate himself.
That's maybe what I was looking for.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she needs to figure out a way to get her money without being killed, because now they think someone's on the way to kill them.
Which is great. Like, we finally do get to that part after there's like a little bit of running around. Like they take him from the gallows and then they are waiting at the place, right? And they get shot. And then there's like some running, like some fact finding that happens very briefly. And then finally, like you realize that she has decided she believes that he hasn't committed the murder. And he is like, well, you're kind of my only way to get around and I only trust you. So that's when they decide like, okay, well, we'll figure out how to get your money and how to get me exonerated together.
Exactly. So now they're working together towards a common goal, and they do a good job of getting towards the common goal at the very end. There's a lot of running around.
Oh, wait, we forgot a very important plot point here. This is part of the convoluted plot point.
Wedding?
The wedding.
The wedding. Yeah. So Colin's
There's a time frame.
reason, yeah, they're on the clock because Colin has 4 days before he needs to stop his brother's wedding to Louisa, who, even though he's messed around with a lot of women and he's known as a womanizer, he was always going to settle down with Louisa. He knows his brother's in love with Louisa, and he loves her too, but he's like, no. I'm going to get Louisa, not Marcus.
Yeah, it's like from the beginning of the book, I think like his love for Louisa is true. It's just like so obviously not right. It's so obviously like a kind of a childhood infatuation thing, which, is part of his journey as a character throughout the book of realizing that. But it's also very like, it's so weak in my eyes, where I'm just like, there's so little development. They've like, it's not like they had a torrid affair or not like they really had much. It was just like they've had one passionate kiss and he's just being kind of naive. And I don't
Yeah,
know.
he just decided he was going to marry her when he was, like 13, and then that's just been his plan the whole time. And in fact, they even talk about his crazy trysts with like, this notorious countess. And it's like, okay, so you've been sleeping around. You've only ever kissed this woman that you're so-called in love with, and yet you're going to marry her?
Yeah. Yeah, that was definitely like it
Oh,
just didn't.
while he's trying to get into Madeline's pants. All right, so now as we're winding down towards the end of the book, as I said, there's lots of running around, there's guards, and it turns out they're able to find the person who can exonerate, now that I have the word correct, Colin. And Madeline has realized that she's in love with Colin, but Colin still has to do this whole wedding thing. And I think it takes up until he lets Madeline go away, that he's like, oh shit, nope, I wanted that one, not
I
this
don't
one.
I don't know. It was weird. So like they have a steamy hayloft moment, and then they have a steamy hotel or in room moment. Um and then they get the person that's going to exonerate him. He runs off to the wedding, right? And she is like, okay, I'm going to go book my passage to America, or I'm going to go take the passage that I've booked to America to start my new life.
Yes.
We also forgot to mention,
They find out
again,
who was trying to kill them.
they do. They find out who is trying to kill them, and there's also a tragic past. And we forgot to talk about Madeline's tragic past.
Oh, yes.
Madeline has a tragic past where she lost her husband and her son and her cheese shop to smallpox and to the bills and that rack up after smallpox. So she's a gentlewoman. She's not of the like upper class. I wouldn't, or maybe gentlewoman is too high to say, but she's like middle class, not of upper class like Colin's family is from. But so
Yeah, but
she
she's
has,
well, like she was raised as gentry, as they would say. She
yeah.
wasn't raised as an aristocrat. She wasn't raised in that upper echelon, but she was raised to have certain expectations of life. I'm going to be a wife. She is educated. She's, was
Yeah, no,
bred a certain way.
yeah, she definitely isn't like, from the slums of St. Giles?
Yeah.
I don't know. I read it. I don't ever say it out loud. Next time I'll look up that pronunciation.
There we
But
go.
yeah, so she's got the tragic past, but he decides to let her go to the docks.
Yeah, because he's still on that whole wedding thing. But there's a beautiful moment at the end where he goes in and he knows his brother Marcus is absolutely head over heels in love with Louisa. Knows it for sure. But he also knows that Marcus is his brother and he loves his brother. And he sits at the back of the wedding and he makes eye contact with Marcus and gives him a nod, and then he kind of lets it happen and he just watches. He doesn't say anything. He doesn't announce his presence to anyone. He just kind of watches the wedding happen. And what's nice is there's a moment at the end too where Louisa comes up to him and she says, I saw you enter the church, but I've made my
Mm-hmm.
choice. And they both nicely agree that while they do love each other in a certain way, they weren't meant to be married and in love.
Yeah. And I liked that. I thought that that was nice. And it felt genuine. I remember when reading it. Yeah. And then there's still more.
Oh, I know, guys. This one has lots of crazy twists and turns because, like I mentioned, there's a parental twist. So we mentioned the Redmond family, and their patriarch is Isaiah Redmond. And he hasn't necessarily been the one to get Colin thrown into jail, but he was definitely doing a lot in his power to stop Colin, like to stop any efforts to get Colin released. So he's been kind of pushing the issue because he really hates the Everseas and he really wants to see them fail in some way. Like he wants to see them caught. But
Mm-hmm.
it turns out Isaiah Redmond and Mrs. Eversea,
Isolde?
yeah,
No.
Isolde,
Isolde?
yeah,
Okay.
Isolde.
Guys, there's a lot of names in these books.
There are. So Isolde, and it turns out Isaiah and Isolde had a little bit of a romance thing going on. And so Isolde, on the behalf of her son, sent a message to Fran
No, Fanchet.
Fanchet. I was like, nope, that's
Fanchet.
not
Right.
Fanchet. Fanchet Redmond, who is Isaiah's wife, and she was like, look, I know we don't talk. I know you got nothing to do with me, but you have to help me with this because Colin does not belong to Jacob. And so there's a big moment because Colin's like, look, I know you were trying to kill this lady. I know you were trying to cover it up, like get me thrown in there. What beef? And then Fanchet's like, la, Isaiah, I couldn't let you kill your son. Sorry. But yeah, it's just so dramatic. And I know I kind of said it very blasé, but this is a big twist because this is also the first book. So when you read all the other books, they almost never mention it again, but you know it. So you know there's crazy history between these families.
Yeah. So in the beginning of the book, there is a quote that I think is really critical for understanding and setting up the entire Redmond and Eversea relationship and just the whole series. So, as Kelsey mentioned with the synopsis, like in the beginning, they are in a bar and it's this wake for Colin. It's not a bar, I should say. It's the pub in their small town of Pennyroyal Green, and everyone's mourning this impending hanging of Colin Eversea. And a stranger rolls into town, and one of the kind of town historians is, it's a strong word for him, but he says this. He asks if the traveler had seen two oak trees that grow very close together in the square as that person rode into town. And he says, those oak trees were mere saplings when William the Conqueror set foot on English shores, and over the centuries their roots have grown so twisted together that they now battle each other for space and depend on each other to remain upright. And this, my friend, is a rather apt metaphor for the Everseas and the Redmonds, for their families have anchored Pennyroyal Green since before this town had a name, since before the conquerors set foot on these shores, and ancient grudges and secrets bind them fast and curse them to this day. And there's another quote, for 'tis said an Eversea and a Redmond are destined to break each other's hearts once per generation. So now we know that last generation was Isolde and Jacob. And
Isaiah.
oh, shoot, dang. Yeah, it was Isaiah. So many names. And it's so funny because in general, like I very rarely remember the names from any of these books. I
Oh,
remember them here
same.
and there and like some stick in my head and I always wonder what makes the name really stick. But anyhow, I digress. So, we know that they're the ones from that generation, and we know from foreshadowing in this book that Lion Redmond, the oldest Redmond child, is gone mysteriously. It probably has something to do with Olivia Eversea, and nobody really knows what happened between them or where Lion has gone. So that is kind of big theme overarching in all of these novels.
Yes, and if you're waiting for Olivia and Lion's book, just strap in because it's going to take a while.
Yeah, you got nine more to read before you get to theirs because theirs is number 11.
Yeah.
All right, so now that we've wrapped that up, shall we go through?
Now that we've adjourned to the parlor, this is where we're going to discuss how you can get a hold of us. Right now, we are at romancepod@gmail.com. We'd love your feedback, any comments, questions, concerns. We'd love to hear from you.
Ideas, book suggestions, anything, we want to hear it all. Well, we'll see. And if you want to check out our Facebook page or our Instagram or our Twitter or our website, you can't because they don't exist yet. We'll work on that for sure. And this is going to be the place where we update you about their existence. So now that we've wrapped that up, shall we get back into it?
We shall.
All right. So, kind of coming back to some of the other things we wanted to discuss. It really, like, this book, I want to talk about tropes, but I want to also just talk about the book in general a little bit. And so it's funny because we were just thinking that there was a whole, like we said, this was a bit convoluted. There were like a lot of pieces to the heist, for lack of a better term, with their whole journey throughout the book that we didn't go into. So if you read this, you'll discover so much more, including like the guy who was behind a lot of it for no reason. It tied in, but this guy was Isaiah Redmond's secretary, and he kind of was being used by Isaiah Redmond's wife as well as Mr. Redmond, and he kind of acted on his own impulses and like was trying to help them both, even though neither of them asked him to do any of the things that he did. And so it all like everything was tied up. The author, she tied everything up and it all had a reason for happening, but a lot of it kind of maybe didn't need to happen.
No, and like the whole thing is they go on this adventure because they think someone's trying to kill her. Turns out that was just his bright idea and he gave up on it almost as soon as they got away.
Yeah. So that danger, that peril, was not really so perilous. And
Yeah.
like I said, if you do pick up this book and read it, there's also like a thing about a giant skeleton. Anyhow, we didn't get into that.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other separate, just nice fact of history, I think.
Yeah, for
Because I'm
sure.
pretty sure it was a real historical man. That actually, I remember listening to another podcast about him, actually.
I think I do too. I think he was on Stuff You Missed in History class.
Exactly.
So that might be a way to date this book, but I think that that's an interesting topic to talk about also because a lot of the time I feel like these books in this genre, you can really easily date them, right? Like they'll have something similar to how Downton Abbey has the sinking of the Titanic in the first episode. So you know, oh, this is when this is happening. A lot of the time there will be kind of other little hints of current events that give you a time and a place. This
Oh,
book,
really quickly, I
yeah.
also forgot to tell our lovely listeners that in the end, Colin and Madeline, they get together
Oh
and
yeah,
they
that does
have a
happen.
lovely reunion. And then they live their life together.
As farmers. He
Yeah.
decides that he, as a former rake, he decides that he's really interested in cows and farming now. Like all of a sudden over, well, I guess he was in jail for a while. But anyhow, we'll get back to that.
Yeah, like that was just his grand plan the whole time was to become like settle down and become a farmer. And then he meets her, they have this wild adventure and he's like, "I'm real ready to live life on a farm." And she's like, "Great, I'll do that with you."
Yeah, she's like, screw America. I'm happy to stay here. All I wanted to do was go to America and find a husband and live on a farm. But
Do
never
that here.
mind. Yeah, we'll just do that here. I'm good. And I mean, they're sweet. They're in love. I'm happy with it all. But yeah. But this book, I think it's interesting because, like I said, this was the first book that I read in this genre. And it was definitely like her all this whole series of books. I don't think you can actually place it historically at a time. The historical accuracy is not what she's going for here, and I'm fine with that. I
Yeah.
like flavor of historical accuracy, but I do not need it to be 100% the way that it was back then. There is like some suspension of belief here, right? Like we can decide that even though yes, like women didn't have this or men didn't have this or they went on a journey for a week and never once talked about, having to use the chamber pot. We just kind of go like, well, we don't need those details, right? So we can enjoy that. But I think it's really interesting because I don't know of that many other series that I have read that are so kind of removed. Pennyroyal Green is also completely made up. Whereas like a lot of these dukedoms are made up names of a dukedom or an earldom or something, but they really follow all of the rest of the constructs where Pennyroyal Green is a whole town with a whole everything that doesn't exist. But it's
And
cool.
they do she very much is like, okay, it's going to take place between like I was also recently reread the last book before we did this, and I will tell you, I couldn't even tell if it was a miswrite for her, but like I straight up didn't know if this thing had taken place over 10 years, 3 years, 2 years. I couldn't even tell you how long these books took place in.
Yeah, and because there is so much that does happen in the series, by the time she does get around to Lion and Olivia, like there seems like a lot of time should have passed. But in reality, I don't think a lot did. I don't know. Regardless, we'll get there and we'll discuss that more in detail at some point. But
Yes. So tell me about some tropes that this book has.
oh my God, there are so many tropes.
The first one I want to talk about is I don't know if it's a trope or not, but let's just talk about scent and the smell and
Oh
how
my God.
he is just tantalized by her lavender scent. He knows it. He knows she's special the instant he gets a whiff of that lavender scent.
I I think that yeah, this is not a trope, but this is like a common romance novel thing, is scents. Like they describe everybody in detail. Like everybody's either like lemon or lavender or bergamot or cedar or whatever it
Oh,
is.
my
But it,
favorite is like that cedar, cigar, and musk.
I know that made him distinctly male.
Yeah.
Um, but the thing that really got me is like so the first time that scent is discussed in this book is very early on. It's when he's been saved from the gallows and brought to this basement, and Madeline is waiting there to get her money, and that's where she gets shot at. And Colin is tied and sitting on a chair with a burlap sack over his head. And so he can't see anything and he can sort of hear something. And then he just like he's smelling things because that's the only sense that's left to him. And he somehow, through his sweat and the burlap sack, can
Ooh, ooh,
smell
ooh.
this
And
lavender.
his ode to Newgate,
Yeah,
which
he's
is
been
his
in
prison
Newgate.
scent.
Yeah, he's been in Newgate, and all of a sudden he can smell this lavender. And okay, I totally understand that talking about lavender, or not lavender, but talking about scents in books, I get why it's used as a device, right? It's another way to build up this characterization and this feeling and this excitement of kind of knowing someone and just anything about them. And it also invokes as a reader definitely a feeling and a thought and just something else. So I totally get that. But and like I said, I'm willing to kind of suspend some belief. But this was a little bit much for me.
Yeah.
Sack over the head, lots of stank. There's just no way he's gonna smell some like lavender essential oils, which probably it's not even essential oil. It's literally like lavender water, because they talk about it later. So it's just a little much. So definitely a funny thing. And I think it's important that we're going to be pointing that one out book by book, what people smell like whenever we
Oh
hear
yeah.
it.
It's real important. It's like the first thing you learn about, especially about the woman, you learn what she smells like.
Yeah. I would say like I wonder what the percentage is because I think the percentage is something like 80-30 or not 80-30. That would be 110. I was really gonna say 80-20, and then I was like, no, 30 for the guys. But I think it's 70-30. Like we learn what the women smells like 70% of the time. We learn about what the men smell like 30% of the time. So, but it'll be interesting. Maybe we'll notice a little bit more as we're like really looking at these books more critically and see if that kind of is right. All right, so I've got a generic list of tropes here, and this one has a lot of them in it because it's got, the tragic backstory for the woman, right?
Oh
She's got
yeah.
her loss of, but it's not just like loss of a husband or loss of a parent or that she had, she was an orphan, but it's like she lost also her kid. I feel like that kind of falls into even maybe another one, loss of a child.
It falls under the widow trope.
Most definitely. The kidnapped trope, right? Like someone's kidnapped, they're being chased. There's a game afoot. There's a wedding that they need to break up. That's another
Oh
trope. I
yeah.
mean,
Oh,
like,
and the fling. This is going to be a short-term thing. They're going to enjoy it and then they're going to part ways.
yeah, and he's also it's funny because like it says he's a rake, but you don't actually feel that much. They like the
Oh,
author does try to like show you how he's a rake, but I feel like his general dialogue and his actions don't feel that way to me.
agreed. We also come under a little bit of the protector trope. They're both a bit of a protector in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's also a little bit of unrequited love because which isn't like how it ends, but earlier on in the story, Madeline realizes she's fallen in love with Colin,
Mm-hmm.
and she knows he's going to go and marry Louisa. So she's like going to, you know, let him go, and because she loves him so much. And then there's also, as the title suggests, like a man in peril. One of the lovers is in physical peril
Yeah.
from something else.
Mm-hmm.
So they help each other, and they help each other get out of it. So that's all wonderful. But yeah, there's like a lot of tropes. I'm sure we could
I
find
just read
even
On
more.
the Road. I was like, oh, they're on the road. Yeah, this is happening.
Yeah. So what do you think about the hero? What do you think about Colin? How does he rank to you as far as characters and heroes go?
Well, I will say I would say he's like a solid like 6 or 7. Like he's not terrible. He has a pretty good idea of himself. Like he's not fighting with too many internal demons. And I hate when they're so busy fighting their own internal demons and
Uh,
projecting onto the other person that they never have a conversation.
yes, that I understand and agree with. So one of the things so I would say for me, Colin is a 5 or a 6. I would guess I'm also probably a much harsher judge than as far as like numbers, but so it looks like we agree on 6, let's
Yeah.
say. Um, he he's got a lot of promise, and I think this comes from this being the author's third book, right?
Hmm.
She's trying to do a few too many things here, and I think that's why her characters don't necessarily get kind of the strongest support. I also think not only is she trying to do so many things in this book, but she's trying to set up a whole series. So she has a lot of work to do within this one book. And that's why I think the hero and the heroine are a little bit weaker than some of
Yeah.
the others as we continue reading.
Well, because
So,
also too, they're just like you said, she's creating characters. She's getting you involved in not just Madeline and Colin, but she's getting you invested and involved in everyone that she's gonna have a book for.
yeah, for sure. So for Colin, for me, I like I remember him as kind of being like funny and also a rake. And it's also there's another series in my opinion that's kind of very similar to this series, also very different, which is the Bridgerton series. And there's
Hmm.
also another rake funny brother named Colin there.
Oh, that's
And
true.
yeah, and to me, the Colin in that book, that is also just an incredible book. That is a great book. Colin Penelope's book is so good.
It's so
But
good. It really
it's
is. But we
so
need to stop talking about the
good.
Bridgertons.
I know. But he pales in comparison to this other Colin. And the reason that I like put them up next to each other is because this Colin and that Colin come from these big family books. They have the same name, but they also have very similar characterizations, right? They're like funny rakes.
Yeah.
And I just think this one is not nearly as strong as that one.
I
But
will say though, I
mhm,
have picked out a perfect semblance about why Colin is who he is to me, and I think this sums him up pretty good. Is all he's doing with it within first setting eyes on her is he's worried about escaping, but he's also literally just trying to decide if she's hot or not.
yeah, he does play the hot or not game like right away. He's like, is she pretty? I can't tell. And then she like moves into a certain light as they are wont to do in this genre, and he realizes, no, she's not pretty. She's gorgeous or
Yeah.
something very
No,
similar to
and
that.
I just feel like that's very him though. Is like because he's in a serious situation, but he's still gonna like assess the hotness level of the girl that's like helped kidnap him.
Yeah, so I mean, priorities. Whatever.
But Madeline, how would you rate her?
So Madeline, I give probably, I would say a 7. She's fine for me. I like her. I think she's interesting. I think that she is given a lot more development than he is. I think that, her backstory is strong. We don't find it out all right away. We find it out in pieces, and the moments that we find it out feel genuine. it's a bit of a coincidence, but when they, have the skeleton sub story, they're talking with a doctor. It happens to be a doctor who was helping her through smallpox when she was at like a smallpox clinic or hospital or something. So that's how we start to find out more about her husband and her, I believe it was son. And so like that really got me. And just in general, like my favorite quote I think of the book came from a moment with her. And so I think Madeline's a solid 7. What about you?
I would agree with that. I like her. I think she's got strong points. I think she has there's I think more that I want. I think I wanted her to be more badass than she was. Like she was fairly badass, but I wanted her to be like just a bit more.
Yeah, I think it felt like she'd been lucky so far in everything she'd
Hmm.
done. And she maybe didn't have, she had, because of the luck of her past jobs, she had a little bit less fear than she should. So then she had this bold facade and then very quickly was brought down by Colin when in the beginning he realizes that the powder in her gun is bad and so she wouldn't be able to fire off a shot with the gun. And so
Yeah.
she felt that with her gun she was safe, and he immediately says this to her and she is like, "Oh my God, who am I? Do I not know what I'm doing?" It's this
Yeah.
kind of moment, but I mean, it felt genuine. Like everything that happened felt genuine and it was fine, but I agree. Like I wanted her to be a little bit more like I've lived a hard life and now I can, do kung fu or something.
Yeah. No, agreed. But since this is a romance novel too, can you give me our encounter counter?
Yes, I sure can. So, in this book, and this is one of the reasons why I think this is a good book for new people to come into the genre, there are approximately 2.5 encounters.
There you go. More
Of
sexual tension than actual like sexual hey hey hey.
Yeah, more tension and kind of build up and also like traveling around than actual steamy moments, shall we say. And I'm not dancing around terminology here, like to not say sex, because there's sex like sometimes wasn't even that much sex. Um,
Yeah.
so, but I think this is, again, like I said, a really good book for people to get into the genre because it's not so sex heavy. So it gives people kind of an opportunity to understand that, yeah, there's a lot that goes on in these books more than just sex. Sometimes the sex can be really great or really fun to read and really bring the story plot forward. But I think like it's just a nice toes in the water to the genre.
Yeah, and if you realize that the sex scenes are your favorite scenes, then there are books that are more sex heavy. This is a nice toe, as you said, it's a good toe in the water. You get a little bit of this, a little bit of that.
Yeah, and it's not, I would say it doesn't, to me, the tension between the two characters isn't strong enough in this book. I remember loving it so much, but thinking about other books, sometimes like the number of encounters, as we're calling them, that they have is not high. Sometimes it's one, but they
Yeah,
literally have so much development and tension and wonderful character building that's such a wonderful reward as a reader.
a hundred
But
percent.
before I'm going to define an encounter as actual, not necessarily penetration, but anything other than kissing. When it goes to more than kissing
I would
and more
agree.
than boob touching,
Mm-hmm.
then anything below the belt we're calling an
There you go.
encounter because I think that that's kind of what we're talking about here. So they have two, and the reason that I say 2.5 is because they have one night in a hayloft and they have one night in an inn and then they wake up the next morning and have a little bit more fun. So it's technically like the same encounter, but there's a few different things, they have night and then morning. So 2.5, right?
Yeah, agreed.
And generally too, it's very, I would say vanilla. Like it's pretty vanilla. It's
It is
not,
pretty vanilla.
yeah, it's nothing too steamy. It is funny because their hayloft encounter has to be very silent, right? Because they
Hmm.
don't want anybody to know that they're there, and they don't even kiss. Which I
Yeah.
remember reading that, and I was like, "Whoa!" Just like taking it below the belt without even
Yeah.
kissing. And I also remember being kind of mad about that. I was like, come on, Colin, like you're supposed to be a rake and you're just kind of like
Yeah.
sticking it in. Like I was a little bit, it's a little abrupt. I think that there's much more rewarding ways as a reader to read about a man and a woman coming together. But, the next morning they have a very cute moment on the road together where he's like, I haven't kissed you yet, and pulls her behind a tree and kind of makes up for it. So I
Oh,
was
that was
like,
super cute. That was a good moment.
yeah, it was cute. So I was willing to let that one slide. So yeah, do you have a favorite quote from this book?
I do have a favorite quote. And let me pull it up right here. Here we go. So I feel like this is it stuck out to me more because I felt it was very good about Madeline. It talks about a heroine, but I think as a woman, I just identified with it very well. And here's the quote. And though Madeline's greatest strength was that she was a woman, and this had ensured her survival to date, she was all too aware that it was her greatest weakness too.
Yeah, that's very sweet. And I think that it encompasses kind of the style of writing that this author has. And we're going to discuss the writing a little bit more, but I really like that about Madeline too. And I think those are kind of the moments that made me feel a connection to Madeline and feel like she was a stronger character than Colin.
Agreed. And, as females, we like good and female empowerment. We are feminists. Even though we do read romance novels, you can be a feminist and read romance novels. I felt like it just encompassed the fight of being a woman. You want to be equal and you want to be counted upon and you want to be looked up to. But at the same time, too, you know that some of the things that make you a strong person are also sometimes seen as your weaknesses. Being overly emotional, getting attached to things, those are very female qualities. But that's also kind of what makes females awesome.
Yeah, and I think that you would agree that it's not even overly emotional, like, right? It's like,
No.
females show emotion. Oh dear Lord.
Yeah.
So throughout the years that it's always been perceived as kind of and more so, and even today perceived as a character flaw, and hopefully we're turning the corner to realize that that is not the case.
Yes.
My favorite quote is also a Madeline moment, and I think like it was just this kind of sweet writing moment of character development. So it's fairly early on in the book. They're at an inn and they're trying to get more information from somebody that they know there. And it says, Madeline Greenway turned away and absently reached out and gave the spit a crank so the fire wouldn't lick over long at one side of the haunch. Something about the homely gesture pierced Colin. Despite their fraught mission, despite her way with a pistol, it was such a very female thing to do, such an ordinary thing to do. And I feel like with that quote, it kind of shows that Madeline is that strong woman, right? That she's like, I am a woman, I am on a mission, I am exhausted, I am being pursued by someone who wants me dead, and here's something that needs doing, and I'm just going to do it. And so
Yeah.
I really liked that quote about her.
Agreed.
So I want to talk about the writing just in general a little bit of the book. We've touched on it here and there. Again, this is the author's third novel. What is your impression of the quality of the writing?
I would say that you can tell that she's had a little bit of practice before. I feel first novels have a hard time staying good with the plot, or they get a little too wordy. Sometimes they over explain one thing and then don't explain enough on another section. So I would say you have a pretty good feel of who the author is, and you can see there's still room for improvement, as we mentioned, the convoluted plot. But I think she does a very good about keeping herself concise, about like keeping herself to her character, and she doesn't overly explain. She doesn't get too flowery with words. I think that there are some sections still where she tends to over explain something, but
Yeah.
it doesn't feel over explained.
Yeah, and I mean, like we said, the book itself maybe isn't the best book she's written, but she had a lot to do here, and I feel like the quality of her writing is good, even very good, and on top of that, she has She has so much to set up and explain, and her enthusiasm is 100% felt. I agree. She actually does, because I get frustrated too when there's unnecessary details. And I remember like she'll have these kind of longer sentences, and almost every time that there's like a long descriptive sentence, I would find myself kind of smiling at the end, because it was something like that where Madeline turned the haunch, and I was like, that to me had an absolute purpose for being said and for being this kind of longer sentence and with a lot of details, but it was there for a reason. And I think
Yeah.
I remember there was absolutely one that I rolled my eyes at. But you know what? If there's one thing that you're rolling your eyes at, I think that's pretty good. In general, I think she's got like a good humor in her writing,
Oh, agreed.
and she's got a lot of wit. She's very self-aware that all of this is a little bit silly, even especially the story. There were moments where she like kind of would like, as an author, be like, yeah, this is a silly story. And you know what?
Yeah,
We're all having a good time here. So
it is,
let's
and it's good.
continue. Yeah, so I think it's good, and like I said, I don't think this is her best book, but I think this is so much better than so many other books, quality of writing wise. Absolutely. She's a great writer.
She is. And you can see her growth through the series, which I think is also great.
Absolutely. And that's why like I really wanted to read things, especially as a series, but 11 books, like I'd love to get the flavor of some other authors in here. You would too. We've
Yeah.
talked about this. Yeah, so feminist recap here. Would we consider this book a supporter, neutral, or an offender?
I would say it's like pretty neutral.
And I say supporter also. Like I think in general there's nothing too, sleazy about the guy or other characters around it. There's no kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's no excuses made for the hero's behavior about something. He
Oh, okay.
generally is a pretty good guy. So that's nice. Most of the writing and the language is pretty good. And it's about a woman who has a job and shoots a pistol and rescues a guy. And so like it's a little bit empowering of the woman's role, and the hero feels pretty impressed with the heroine.
Yeah,
So I feel it's somewhere between neutral and supporter for sure.
yeah, I think that's where I am. I'm kind of in the middle. I feel like it wasn't. See, for me, I feel a full supporter was, as I said, I want Madeline just to be a little more badass,
Mm-hmm.
and so I feel like it's towards supportive. It doesn't do anything to offend any sort of thing. Like it is very female positive,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I just like there could have just been that push a little bit more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there was only one moment where I kind of went like, that's maybe not how I'd want to see that or read it. Again, these are period books, so I feel like anytime I'm pulling out a quote like I'm about to pull out, it's kind of more a reflection of that it's the year 2019, and all of a sudden I'm more aware of these sort of sentences, even though, again, it's a period book. The people that actually lived in this period would be way worse than this. But
Oh yeah.
when I'm reading a book and I'm like thinking about like how supportive and feminist it is, or just modern it is, I always love when they can really make something feel really modern and empowering, even somehow staying in those historical constructs. So here
Agreed.
there's just a moment where they're talking to this innkeeper, same place she turned the spit, and he says something about they don't understand why. Oh my God, my book just turned off. This is the perils of a ebook. Uh, but the innkeeper is talking about why he happens to know so much about fashion, because he noticed a lot about someone who they needed to know, have more information about. It says, "It's my wife. If you gets yourself a wife one day, Mr. Eversea, you'll come out with things like that too. Mark my words, mark my words. This matches with this, or this matches with this, and so on." They talk like that, women do. "She makes me look at things and give opinions. She'll turn me into a girl yet." And it's just it's cute, but it's also like she'll turn me into a girl yet. Like
Yeah.
I had this moment where I was like, like if it had just been like not that sentence, like if that sentence hadn't been there, she'll turn me into a girl yet, because like who gives, like at this point in life, and in my life, I don't give a care. Like You do you. And so if it just hadn't had that sentence, or it had switched it out just slightly, I think it would have landed a little bit better for me. But honestly,
Agreed.
that is nitpicking. And like I said, it's a historical piece. The actual people that lived in that time would be um, a lot different.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So I have one last question for you, and I think the answer is pretty clear. But Kelsey, would you recommend this book?
I think so, seeing as I have recommended it to you, as well as other people in the past. I feel like I'm pretty solid in the recommend category.
I also recommend this book, but I don't necessarily recommend it to everyone. I think this is a perfect one to recommend to someone you know in your heart of hearts is going to love this genre, and you kind of want them to get in and really like love the series and love the every like I think there's so much to offer. So like fantasy readers is great. It's a great transition. You've got a long series, a lot of characters, but you don't have to read each one to know what's going on. So I think that's good. For me, certain other friends, a friend that I didn't think would love romance novels, I gave her a different one. So
Yeah.
I think it just depends. I still think this is a great book. I recommend it. I'm glad we chose it as our first one to review, even though it was very hard to actually review when we started reading it and remembering how crazy the plot was.
Yeah. But it was fun to reread. I'm not usually one to reread books, so for me, when I get to now that I was like, oh, let's reread this, and all of a sudden I was like, wait, I want to reread the whole series, which, eventually I will.
Me too. We're going to be doing that, and I think that it's safe to say that next time we are going to be reading the second book in the Pennyroyal Green series, Like No Other Lover, which is about two characters we have not yet met. Actually, there might have been like half a moment of Miles Redmond, but
You
we're
know he
switch-
exists.
we met Miles before briefly. I think he was like trying to make his dad proud or something because he is now the oldest son now that Lion Redmond is just mysteriously gone, so he is going to inherit. And
I
I
think
think
he
that's
was playing chess. Maybe.
maybe paying, yeah. So we don't know much about him yet, and I am actually really excited. I
I am
forgot
too.
about this book. I
I
really like this one.
secret. I think I read Miles's book first, and then I realized it was a series, and so I stopped. I went back, read Colin's book, and then carried on.
Yeah, no, I am excited. This number two is going to be great. So we're probably going to read, I think what we've decided is we're going to read number one, number two, number three. And then at that point, we're going to make a judgment call of where we want to go from there. If we want to stick in another short series in between. And we've got a cool thing to do for how we choose our next series, but we'll get to that when we get to that.
Yes. So thank you all for listening.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye bye.
Yeah. In the beginning of the book, there is a quote that sums up the Edmonds and the Edmonds, damn it. In the beginning of the book, there is a quote that I feel like is so important. It's kind of critical to understanding the Edmonds and the ever. I said it again, Edmonds and Reverses.
Redmonds.
Okay. In the beginning of the book, there is a quote that I think really sums up the Edmonds.
Redmonds.
Oh my fucking God. Okay. Once more for good measure. In the beginning, shoot, I forgot to pause. I can't remember this second book. I'm looking it up.
I figured you were, because honestly, I couldn't remember it either.
I'm pretty sure it's Chase's book. Book two, Like No Other
Miles?
Lover. Oh, it's Miles.
Yay.
Oh my God, that's gonna be such a crazy nightmare to edit. But
It is, but it's okay because we'll get better at it as we go. It's the first one. Just like this book.
100%.
Just
Yeah.
like this rambly book. This is our
Yes.
rambly podcast.
This is our Rambly podcast, like the Rambly book.